My brother was working casual shifts for a private security contractor. They supplied overnight guards to locations that didn't warrant permanent staff. And one of his short-term assignments was a rural cemetery that had ongoing vandalism issues, mainly teenagers damaging headstones and breaking into old mausoleums. The job involved slow vehicle patrols, use of handheld spotlights, and calling local police if trespassers were ever found. No weapon and no partner. The cemetery bordered open farmland and scrub, and at the time the area had a known problem with dumped dogs forming loose packs. This wasn't rumor. Local councils had issued notices about it, in fact, and my brother had already seen stray dogs there on previous nights and wasn't particularly alarmed by them. Now, on this night, shortly after midnight, he noticed a larger than usual group of dogs near the back section of the grounds. He estimated maybe 7 or 8 of them, and among them was a large Rottweiler-type dog, several mixed breeds with him, and one small white dog still wearing a faded harness. That detail stood out to him because it clearly had not been feral very long. The dogs weren't aggressive toward him or the vehicle. They were just sort of moving around, sniffing, and occasionally play fighting. So he continued his patrol as usual, and about 20 minutes later, while driving with the window down and the spotlight resting on the doorframe, the dog suddenly became very agitated. He described the sound as a shift from random barking to focused alarm, short, sharp, and aggressive barks, and then they all stopped at once. Immediately after the silence, he heard a noise that he couldn't identify. He struggled to describe it without referencing fiction, but said that it was a mix of strained human voice and an animal distress call, with a harsh, vibrating undertone. But what bothered him most, though, was that it carried directionally, like something moving quickly rather than echoing. Seconds later, something crossed the headlights at a speed that was unbelievable, is what he said. He described it as tall, light-colored, and moving unevenly. The dogs followed immediately, and his first concern wasn't fear. It was actually that the dogs were chasing another animal or someone's escaped pet or something. He parked, took the spotlight, and followed on foot. The barking intensified, and then that same noise happened again. This time he said that he thought that he heard a word buried in it, though. Something close to help, though he admitted that it could have just been his brain forcing meaning onto a sound. In any case, he reached a row of older mausoleums and shone the light toward the noise, and the dogs had cornered what he initially assumed was a deer. But the longer that he looked at this thing, the less that it fit. The animal was thin to the point of distortion, its coat a uniform grey rather than brown, and it was standing too close to the wall to move naturally. When the light hit its face, the eyes didn't reflect at all. He said they looked sort of flat, in fact, like there was nothing behind them. The dogs were circling and snapping at this thing, but each time one made contact, it recoiled violently, gagging sort of and backing off. None of them attempted to bite again except for one. The Rottweiler came from behind my brother, passing close enough to brush him, and it charged. It hit the animal low, knocked it off balance, and bit down hard. At that moment, the animal emitted the same sound again, louder this time, and struck the dog with its front leg in a way that my brother said looked deliberate rather than reflexive, and seemed impossible. The dog released immediately, though, and the animal fled. It didn't limp. It moved quickly, and the dogs followed it out of sight. My brother, completely spooked at this stage, returned to his car quickly and ended his shift shortly afterward. He never filed a report beyond noting wildlife disturbances, and he refused further assignments at that location. 3 days later, he asked me to come back with him during daylight, and he wanted to check for something. Near the same mausoleum row, the small white dog with the harness was still there, and it was skittish but friendly, and we did manage to get it into the car at one point. That dog, well, she lived with us for another 5 years. She never showed any aggression toward anything as well. but always panicked during storms and reacted badly to certain sounds at night. Otherwise, she was a good dog. Now, I don't know what my brother saw, and I know that he's not prone to exaggeration, and I know that the dog was real because, well, I carried it home. But everything else in this story just sits in a space that I cannot verify or dismiss. What has always stayed with me is that my brother swears by everything, and, well, he's never been the type to lie, especially to me. For some context, I help my mother a few evenings a week at a roadside service station that she owns. It's located on a secondary highway outside of a small agricultural town. There's nothing nearby except for some paddocks, a truck pull-off area, and a closed roadhouse a few hundred meters down the road. After dark, traffic stops off almost completely. So this happened in early of July of 2021. My mother messaged me that afternoon asking if I could cover the evening shift from roughly 5:30 until closing at 10:30. I agreed and arrived just before sunset, and she spent most of the night in the back office doing stock orders and paperwork or something, while I was handling the counter and restocking. Now, at around 7:45, while I was refilling the drinks fridge, the front door sensor chimed, and I went to the counter and saw a man already standing near it. He appeared to be in his late 40s or maybe early 50s. His clothes didn't really match the weather, heavy boots and worn trousers, but a clean and thin jacket. His movements, though, were unsteady, not exaggerated and just sort of poorly controlled, as if his balance was delayed. When he spoke, it took a few seconds to understand what he wanted. His speech was slow and sort of fragmented, and his eyes were noticeably bloodshot. I initially assumed alcohol, possibly combined with exhaustion, which isn't totally uncommon with long-haul drivers in this area. He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, and I pointed him to the restroom without further interaction. He returned a minute later and stood at the counter without saying anything. He didn't look at me directly, but instead his eyes sort of drifted between the ceiling, the floor, and the window. His skin looked unusually pale under the fluorescent lighting. His trousers were heavily soiled around the cuffs, but his upper clothing was clean, which struck me as very inconsistent. After standing there in silence for nearly a full minute, he turned and left without buying anything. He then turned and left without buying anything. Less than 5 minutes later, another man entered the store. He was much younger, early 20s at most, dressed in clean, branded streetwear that didn't fit the rural setting. He immediately asked if I had seen a guy who shouldn't be on his own, adding that the person had wandered off. He described someone who didn't resemble the first man at all, but I told him that a man matching some of the behavior that he described had been in the store briefly but had already left. As he spoke, I noticed the same traits though. Delayed speech, unfocused eyes, and a sort of odd flatness in his expression. His pupils were constricted, and his face had the same sort of washed-out tone. What alarmed me most, though, was that he was barefoot. The car park outside was wet and near freezing, and he turned and left before I could say anything else, but I tried calling out to him, but he didn't respond or slow down. At that point, I told my mother what had just happened, and she told me to alert her immediately if either of them came back, and suggested that we keep the front door locked between customers for the remainder of the night. Thankfully, they didn't return. When we closed up just after 10:30 and walked to the car, I noticed a vehicle parked well away from the main forecourt lights. The younger man was sitting in the driver's seat. All 4 doors were open and the engine wasn't running. He was staring straight ahead, hands in his lap, completely still. My mother didn't see him, and I didn't point it out. I wasn't sure why, but at the time I told myself that there was nothing actionable to really report. No threats, no confrontations, no clear emergency. Well, The next morning I checked the local police notices and there was an eerie report about a guy who had apparently broken into a house, held somebody hostage with a knife and, well, had left before the police had got there, and now the police were asking for information from the public. I told the police about what I had seen that night, and to make a long story short, they actually caught this guy. And yes, he was the guy who had broken into this house and had apparently held some poor family up with a knife or something. His accomplice was the guy in the car, and, well, they had apparently made their way to us that night, and, well, the police got them in the end. I am grateful that nothing happened to us that night, but from what I heard from the police, the guy was high as a kite on something, and that he was completely unstable, and so yeah, that explains his behavior, and also a lot of the conditions of that night. In early 2016, I was renting a one-bedroom unit in a mid-rise apartment complex near Tacoma, Washington. The building dated back to the late 1970s and had been renovated multiple times. Nothing about it stood out too much. No reputation, no local stories, no obvious red flags. I was working irregular hours at the time and sleeping pretty poorly, which is relevant to the story. So one night, sometime after midnight, I woke up unable to move. I recognized it immediately as sleep paralysis. I'd experienced it twice before in my life, in fact. My breathing felt shallow and I couldn't speak. That part wasn't new. What changed, though, was the mental imagery. Instead of the usual sense of pressure or panic, I experienced a detached perspective, as if my awareness had shifted away from my physical position. I perceived myself lying on the bed from an elevated angle, not sharply defined, but more like an impression than a visual scene. In this state, there was a second presence. I didn't see a clear face, but I registered long hair and the sensation of my head being supported, like somebody was holding it steady. The dominant feeling wasn't fear. It was neutral, almost procedural-like an interaction that had rules that I didn't quite understand. There was no spoken dialogue, but I had a strong impression that I was being prompted to identify the person. Not threatened, but encouraged. I resisted the idea, mostly because the experience already felt way too intrusive. At some point, the pressure to engage intensified, though, and then the episode ended abruptly. I woke fully alert and emotionally unsettled, as you could probably imagine, though not panicked completely. I wrote it off as an unusually vivid night terror episode, and I just didn't tell anyone. Well, the next day I found myself fixated on the building. I looked up its permit history and old listings. Not because I expected to find anything specific, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the apartment as a physical space rather than just where I slept. I didn't find anything remarkable. No deaths, no police reports tied to my unit. Really, there was nothing. Over the following weeks, small incidences began to accumulate, though. On 2 separate occasions, I returned home to find my door unlocked. Nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. I assumed that I had made a mistake, even though I was normally very careful about locking up. Another time, I heard movement in the hallway outside of my unit late at night. Footsteps stopped directly outside of my door and remained there long enough for me to notice the absence of sound afterward. When I checked through the peephole, the hallway was empty, though. The most concrete incident, though, occurred one afternoon when I went to visit a friend who lived in the same complex, 2 floors down. I knocked and was certain that somebody looked through the peephole. I saw a shift in light and shadow close to the lens, but when no one answered, I called my friend. She was across town, confirmed by a timestamp photo that she sent without prompting. We returned together a little bit later. I kept my eyes on the apartment the whole time, but the apartment was empty and completely unchanged. was around the same time as well that I began noticing my name written in public places, not tagged or vandalized, chalk, dry erase markers, things that could be easily removed. Once on a whiteboard outside of a cafe, once on a concrete utility cover near a bus stop that I didn't normally use. These weren't dramatic messages, but just my first name spelled correctly with no context. I didn't confront anyone or report anything. I mean, what do you say about that, right? None of it rose to the level of suspicion or a crime or anything, but still, the cumulative effect changed how I behaved. I slept with the lights on. I avoided being alone in the apartment when I could. And eventually, at the suggestion of a co-worker, I contacted a local counselor, not a religious figure, and not someone focused on belief systems, but during our first sessions, without prompting, she asked whether I associated the apartment with a sense of being watched or evaluated. That phrasing stuck with me because it matched what I hadn't said out loud. And well, eventually, I moved out when my lease ended. Thankfully, nothing followed me afterward, no similar dreams, no unexplainable incidences, and my sleep normalized within a few months. I don't claim to know what actually caused this. I'm open to the idea that maybe stress, or maybe there was a suggestion that filled in the gaps of my brain that it just couldn't resolve. What I know, though, is that the experience definitely changed how I evaluate my own perceptions. I'm more cautious now about assuming that discomfort always has a visible source, and more aware of how long uncertainty can linger after the situation itself has ended. A few years back, my family temporarily relocated to a newly completed residential block in the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. The building was 14 floors, but only the first 2 levels were approved for occupancy at the time. The remaining floors were structurally complete, but still undergoing interior work. This was permitted locally, despite the obvious safety issues, but we were among the first occupants. The apartment was on the ground level, directly facing a busy service road. There was constant traffic noise, nearby shops, and construction activity during the day. Nothing about the environment suggested isolation or abandonment is what I'm getting at. And at night, exterior lighting from the street and the adjacent buildings remained on all night. At the time I was 17, my cousin who had moved in with us temporarily was 18, and we shared a bedroom. We were both pretty academically inclined, and generally pretty dismissive of superstition. Conversations between us tended to be pretty practical: school, current events, technical topics. That night was no different. This happened roughly 2 weeks after moving in. So we had stayed awake until early morning talking, and around 4 in the morning, we had stopped speaking, and I remember turning toward the wall and beginning to drift into sleep. I was not fully out yet, but I was abruptly shaken awake by my cousin. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was strained, and he asked if I had seen that thing. When I asked him to clarify, he paused and then told me to forget about it. This was unusual behavior for him. He was certainly not prone to panic like that. He was looking toward the bedroom doorway, which opened into a short corridor leading to the living area. The corridor lights were off, and all the windows were covered with thick curtains, which we had installed ourselves due to construction dust and light pollution. But I followed his gaze, and what I observed, I will never forget. It was not a figure, but a concentrated source of light moving through the corridor. It was elongated and narrow, angled slightly downward, with a brighter center and uneven edges that appeared to shift as it moved. It was not steady like a flashlight beam. It didn't sweep or scan. It sort of moved laterally, as if passing through the space rather than being projected onto it. The light reflected off the painted walls and the tiled floor, which allowed me to track its movement, even when it was partially obscured by the doorframe. There was no visible source, no sound accompanied it. No shadows were cast that would suggest a person carrying something. I reacted immediately though and asked my cousin if that was what he had seen. He confirmed it without hesitation and described it in the same terms that I would have used. Before either of us could speak further though, it disappeared. But then, less than a minute later, it reappeared further down the corridor, closer to the living room. Its movement was faster this time as well. The intensity fluctuated slightly, as if passing behind obstacles that were not physically present. At that point, both of us yelled, not because of what it was, but because of just how little sense it made. We left the room and woke the adults. Lights were switched on throughout the apartment, and when they went to go and check, the corridor was now empty. There were no open doors, no windows uncovered, no active construction lights visible from our unit. The external road lighting was constant and diffused, and not directional like this. This was genuinely like some sort of a floating ball of light. Later explanations focused on reflection from construction equipment or passing vehicles. The problem with that explanation is structural. The corridor had no direct line of sight to the street. The curtains were double-layered and secured. The angles required for a reflected light source to move in that manner, at that speed, without interruption, just didn't align with the layout of the apartment. I remember trying to see this thing again, but no similar incident occurred again during our stay there. We lived there for several more months, construction continued, and nothing unusual followed. I guess the lack of reoccurrence made it easier to ignore for everyone, but it certainly never resolved the inconsistencies of it all. It's something that I still talk about from time to time with my family, and I still don't have an explanation for whatever that was. The building that this took place in was part of a post-war housing row with timber framing and shared structural elements between units. I lived there with my mother while saving to move out. The house had persistent creaks, temperature shifts, and noise transfer from neighboring units, none of which was out of the ordinary. Now, on the first night there, shortly before 11 p.m., I was lying in bed scrolling on my phone when the mattress sort of jolted near the lower left corner. It felt like a blunt impact rather than vibration, and the bed frame didn't slide, neither did anything fall, but I don't own any pets, and I assumed that somebody downstairs had bumped a wall, or maybe that the building had shifted, so I didn't investigate any further. The following night at 10:40 p.m., the same movement occurred again though. But this time it happened 3 times within roughly 10 seconds. The timing caught my attention because it was nearly identical to the previous night, and the force was localized, as if pressure was being applied upward from below the mattress rather than the floor shifting beneath it. I got up immediately. My mother was upstairs in the bathroom with the shower running. Nobody else was in the house. No appliances were on that could cause vibration. There was also no noticeable traffic outside at that moment. As a child, I had experienced episodes of unexplainable bed movement in a different house, which had eventually been attributed, without any evidence mind you, to pipes and structural resonance. Remembering that, I tried to rationalize this as a similar mechanical issue. But still, I have to admit that the repetition, it bothered me. I went downstairs to get some water and try to calm myself down a little bit. While I was there, my mother finished showering and asked why I was pacing back and forth, and I explained what I felt. She suggested that we should check the other rooms to see if anything felt unusual, and this wasn't something that we normally did, and so it was a bit weird, I'll admit, but her bedroom felt immediately uncomfortable. Not in like an emotional sense, but like physically. The air felt stagnant and warmer than the rest of the house, despite identical heating. The hallway outside of her room had the same sensation. A small office at the end of the hall felt normal by comparison. There were no smells, no sounds, just a noticeable difference in how long I wanted to remain in each space. I returned to my room, intending to lie back down and just ignore the situation and try and calm down and get some sleep. But less than a minute later, my mother screamed from the office. It wasn't a startled yell, it was a sort of sustained panic response as well. So I quickly ran to her. She was shaking and said that someone had leaned close and spoken directly beside her ear. She couldn't make out the words, but only the breath and the proximity, but when she turned, nobody was there. At that point, I reacted emotionally and shouted into the house, telling whoever or whatever it was to leave. I'm aware that this response had no logical basis, and look, it was definitely just reflexive, and I'm even a bit embarrassed to include it in here, but that's what I did. Afterwards, though, we contacted a family acquaintance who claimed to have experience with sensitive situations like this. She stayed on video call with us while we walked through the house, and she offered a narrative involving two presents, one aggressive and one defensive, and tied the bed movement to the smaller one attempting to get some attention. I didn't accept this explanation, but I also couldn't replace it with any better one. We eventually attempted basic environmental checks too. Heating off, windows opened, breakers inspected, but nothing ever changed. The bed movement continued intermittently, always in the same location and always very brief. Eventually, out of exhaustion rather than belief really, we moved pillows and blankets onto the floor beside the bed and left the mattress untouched. The impact stopped after that too, though I don't know if that was just coincidence or maybe timing or something, but I didn't sleep. I sat upright with the lights on until morning most nights. Every minor shift or weight felt amplified, and I avoided the hallway entirely. When daylight finally came each day, everything felt ordinary again. No marks, no damage, no repeat events during the day. Nothing like this happened again after that week, and we lived in the house another year without further incidents, thankfully. And I guess the most unsettling part isn't the memory of the fear of it all, but it's that despite the inspections and the time, I still cannot identify a mechanical cause that accounts for the timing, location, and the consistency of what occurred. I haven't told this story to anyone outside of my family before, mostly because I still can't fully explain what happened. I'm 55 now as well, but this all started when I was a teenager in 1978. So I grew up in a small community on the northern edge of the New England Plateau in southern Vermont. The settlement was isolated with fewer than 300 people. Forests surrounded us on all sides, merging into public conservation land to the north and to the east. The local kids, myself included, spent most of our free time hiking trails, exploring old logging roads, and occasionally hunting as well. It was a landscape that, by the late 70s, had been mapped and logged, but still contained stretches that were untouched by modern activity. Now, at 13, I had a small motorbike which let me explore deeper into the woods than before. One afternoon, I discovered a narrow trail that ran along a ridge, and it wasn't maintained and had clearly been used long before cars, and probably by wagons in fact. Possibly early logging equipment really, but on my way back I emerged near a house where an elderly woman sat on the porch. I'll call her Mrs. L, though that's obviously not her real name. She waved me over. "Did you ride all the way through the ridge trail?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Don't go back there again," she said, her tone firm. "There's a reason it's blocked, you know." I asked why, and she motioned for me to sit down. She told me about the local legend of something she called the Plateau Walker. According to her, over 50 years prior, two neighboring families, the Connors and the Millers, had small farms on the opposite sides of the hollow below the ridge. The story took place in the early 1900s, before even electricity reached the hills. On a Saturday night, the boys from both families socialized well past midnight, playing cards and drinking homemade spirits, when the youngest Miller boy tried to ride home along across the hollow, and he reported seeing two glowing red eyes atop a boulder at the creek crossing. The creature was reportedly whistling, a high, shrill sound that sent his horse into a panic. He fired his revolver multiple times as it attacked his horse, hitting it, but the creature vanished into the forest before he could pursue it. The next morning, he and the other boys returned, finding no evidence of the creature, or the horse, or his gear, only a faint trail of blood and sand that seemed deliberately erased. Mrs. L said that she didn't believe the story until decades later when she found a similar disturbance under a pile of brush while gathering firewood one day, a hollow under the brush, eyes staring up at her, forcing her to drop her axe and run. At that moment convinced her that the Plateau Walker, or something like it, was real. And so I left that day, sort of convinced to just avoid the hollow out of caution. Years later, at 26, after a brief military stint and some personal setbacks, I returned to Vermont for some work. I spent much of my free time hiking in the same general area, and there was one place in particular that drew me in. A line of sandstone cliffs along the western ridge, with a sparse old-growth pine grove at the top. The grove was pretty isolated, with thick pine needles covering the forest floor everywhere, and a pretty heavy canopy that blocked the moonlight. I carried a small pack, a few supplies in my Winchester 12 gauge loaded with 5 rounds. One evening, I'd been out hiking into the night, returning from a survey point at the base of the cliffs. Around midnight, while resting near the edge of the pine grove and watching some distant valley lights, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. At first it sounded like quail, but I knew quail aren't nocturnal, and the call came from multiple points along the ridge, moving closer in a pattern that mirrored my own movements. At first, I assumed it was a hooting owl or some other misidentified bird, but then the pattern repeated, step for step, sound for sound. It was almost like it was tracking me as I packed my things up. My instincts told me that I wasn't alone, and I wasn't being observed casually. I was being followed. I moved toward a narrow crevice in the cliffs which opened to a ledge about 30 feet above the base. I crawled through this tight space, dragging my pack and my gun. Below me I could hear movement, footsteps, heavy and irregular, distinct from any deer or human that I could make out. Once on the ledge too, I climbed to the grove and crouched behind a large pine. The sounds followed, but this thing stopped at the edge of the grove, staying just out of my sightline. I switched on a flashlight mounted on my gun, but the beam illuminated nothing. I then heard long, deliberate steps circling the grove. The cadence was strange too, heavier than a human's, but not perfectly quadrupedal either. I fired a single round into the brush at this point. Immediately, too, I heard a sound that froze my blood. A deep guttural scream, sort of part animal and something else, unlike anything that I'd ever heard before. The steps retreated quickly, breaking into the woods, and the silence returned. I stayed there still until dawn, checking the edges of the grove periodically, but thankfully there were no further sounds. A few months later, I moved to a small property in southern Vermont, at the base of the same ridge really, and the land was 35 acres, bordered by forests that funneled wildlife along narrow corridors. My daughter lived there already, and her large protective dog, an old Labrador mix named Rex, reacted aggressively at night, barking and growling toward the edge of the woods there. Whenever I investigated, I never saw anything, but the sounds of heavy footsteps like the ones on the ridge, I swear that I heard them moving away from the property a few times. Rex passed away a few years ago, and now with a new dog, I noticed the same pattern occasionally. Alert, growling, barking at empty spaces outside, but no evidence of anything there, and no trace of anything or anyone having been there at all. I've never returned to the cliffs or that hollow, and I do continue to hike and camp elsewhere, but something about that part of the ridge, between the old sandstone cliffs and the thick pine groves, there's something there, and so it remains off limits to me and my family. Based on local reports and historical accounts, the thing that I encountered is pretty consistent with the description of a bipedal, large, foul-smelling creature that is apparently in the area, an animal that can mimic sounds and move pretty silently, and intimidate both humans and animals. Some call it Bigfoot, or skunk ape in other regions, but locally, it seems to have a unique whistling behavior, and so people call it the Whistler. I've never seen it directly in daylight. I only know what I've heard and what I felt, and what my dog reacted to, and what some other people have said. That's enough for me, though, to ensure that I won't be venturing into that grove ever again. At the time that this happened, I was studying in a coastal city in southern Chile, in an area that students often described as relaxed, compared to the capital at least. But that description is only really partially true. The city has long stretches where police response is very slow, informal settlements border student housing, and violent robberies are common enough that you learn certain habits pretty quickly. Don't linger, don't walk distracted, and don't assume that public places are safe just because the people use them. Despite knowing this, though, a group of us made a poor decision one Friday evening. After some exams, 4 of us drove to a hill outside of the city limits that overlooked the river valley. It was a known lookout spot, and students went there to drink, smoke, and watch the sunset from time to time. There had been some incidences in the past there, assaults, thefts, but none of us had personally experienced anything serious, which tends to create a false sense of immunity, right? Well, we arrived just before dusk. There were no other vehicles parked nearby, which we took as a positive sign rather than a warning. The road was unpaved, and the area was surrounded by thick scrub and uneven terrain. We stayed inside the car, windows up, talking and passing some time. Nothing felt immediately wrong, and the light was fading slowly, and the city noise below was still pretty audible. Now, at some point, while turning to look out the passenger side window, I noticed movement that didn't match the wind. About 6 meters away, partially concealed by bushes and tall grass, were 4 adult men. They were crouched low, not sitting or standing. Their clothing was dirty and mismatched, and none of them appeared surprised to see us. What stood out most was their stillness. They were not whispering or shifting, they were watching. It took a second for my brain to process what I was seeing, but then the context clicked. Isolated location, no witnesses, fading light, blocked escape routes on foot. I didn't try to stick around to analyze the motives. Instead, I shouted to the driver that we needed to leave immediately. He reacted without hesitation and accelerated hard down the road. As we gained distance, I looked back through the rear window. 2 of the men had stepped out from the brush and onto the road. They didn't chase the car, they didn't wave or shout. They simply stood there facing us, watching us leave. And it was then that I noticed that one of them had a rifle and the other seemed to have a pistol. We drove straight back into the city, and we didn't stop until we were in a populated, well-lit area. No one really spoke much afterward, but the adrenaline wore off slowly, and it was replaced by delayed fear, I guess. We all reached the same conclusion independently, that if we had exited that vehicle, even briefly, the situation, well, it would have escalated quickly. Whether the intent was robbery or something worse, that didn't matter. The outcome would not have been controlled by us, that much was certain. I have returned once to that hill during the day with other people around, and it looked ordinary. Nothing marked it as dangerous, and I guess that's the part that really bothers me the most. The threat was not dramatic or obvious in any way. It was quiet, patient, and would have remained invisible if I hadn't have happened to just sort of look in the right direction at the right moment. Since then, I don't treat familiar places as safe by default anymore. I don't assume that because others go somewhere that it's benign, and I don't stay in isolated areas after dark as well, no matter how routine it might seem. Thankfully, nothing physically happened to us that night, but the realization of just how close something could have happened, well, that stayed with me far longer than any actual injury probably would have. At the time that this happened, I was studying, but I wasn't living in student accommodation. My parents had arranged a small apartment in a mixed residential block, mostly older tenants, some short-term renters as well, but not much social interaction. It was quiet, which I actually appreciated. But in hindsight, that quiet mattered more than I understood then. The first encounter happened on a weekday afternoon while I was walking back from a discount grocery store near the main tram line. As I passed the entrance, I noticed a man standing off to the side, not waiting for transport or talking to anyone. He was tall, likely late 30s or early 40s, with close-cropped hair and heavy work boots that looked worn down unevenly. What caught my attention, though, wasn't so much his appearance as his focus. He watched me pass without looking away, as if he were assessing something rather than casually observing. I dismissed it, though. I mean, cities are full of people who stare. Over the next several weeks, I began seeing him repeatedly, though. Not every day, but often enough that it stopped feeling coincidental. He appeared outside of the same grocery store, sometimes leaning against the wall and sometimes standing near the bike racks. Later, I noticed him near a campus building that I regularly used, sitting on a low concrete barrier as students passed by. He never approached me, and he never spoke. He always just watched. I told myself that our schedules overlapped and that I was assigning meaning where there just wasn't any. But the situation, it changed the night that I noticed the boot prints. So it was just after 9:30 p.m. and I had gone downstairs to take out the rubbish. The hallway lighting on my floor was dim and motion activated. Near my apartment door as well, I saw several fresh scuff marks on the tile, muddy, irregular tread patterns consistent with heavy boots. They hadn't been there earlier that day. The building was old though, and sound carried easily, so I assumed that someone had been wandering the halls and tried not to dwell on it. Well, at around 2 in the morning, I woke abruptly. There was no noise that I could identify, no knocking and no voices, but I felt alert in a way that just didn't feel natural. I stayed in bed for several minutes before getting up and quietly walking to the door. I looked through the peephole and the man was sitting on the floor directly in front of my apartment, back against the opposite wall, legs bent, head tilted forward. At first, I genuinely thought that I was dreaming or just seeing things. Then he shifted his weight and straightened slightly. He hadn't been sleeping. I stepped back instinctively but didn't return to bed. I stayed frozen, just listening. After a short pause, he stood up and seemed to position himself squarely in front of the door. There was no hesitation about it. He placed his hand on the handle and pressed it down once, then again with more force. When it didn't open, I think that he may have leaned forward and pressed the side of his head against the door, as if listening for movement. At least that's what it sounded like. I didn't make a sound though. I was standing less than a meter away. He then knocked once, quietly and deliberately. It wasn't a mistake or an accident. He then spoke under his breath, and I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't a greeting. He rang the doorbell once, and again after a pause. Finally, he stepped back and looked directly at the peephole. He smiled briefly without an expression, as if acknowledging confirmation of something. Then he turned and walked down the corridor towards the stairwell. I listened until I was sure that he had left the floor. As you can probably imagine too, I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. In the morning, I checked the hallway. There were fresh boot marks directly in front of my door, overlapping the older ones. Later that week, I altered my routine completely. Different grocery store, different tram stops, different hours, everything that I could think of. And I never did see him again. Not on campus, not near the apartment. In fact, nowhere. I did report the incident to the building manager, who reviewed the camera footage from the ground floor, but nothing that was found was identifiable, really. I and they didn't contact the police at the time because, well, there was no forced entry, no direct threat, and nothing concrete enough to act on. Just really weird behavior. I also moved out 3 months later, and what still unsettles me is not that he tried the door, but that he just knew where I lived. He didn't wander the building. Instead, he went directly to my apartment and just waited. That implies planning and not impulse. And whatever he intended to do was interrupted not by resistance, but I think by uncertainty. And that is the part that I find the hardest to forget. At the time that this took place, my partner and I were living in a dense outer suburb of Manchester, in England. We rented the lower unit of a converted townhouse that had been split vertically rather than by floor. Both units shared the same narrow front path, which ran from a street-level gate up to 2 separate entrances. Our door was the second one, partially sort of recessed, and there was no exterior lighting along that path. At night, the only illumination came from nearby streetlights, which really didn't reach the gate. We returned home just after midnight, though, following a live show in the city centre. We were tired, slightly distracted, and decided to order some food through a delivery app instead of cooking. The account was in my name, which clearly identified me as a female. I didn't think about that detail at the time, but the order took way longer than we expected. And after roughly 40 minutes, the courier sent a message through the app apologizing for delays due to traffic or something. I responded briefly and didn't think too much of it. But a second message came about 10 minutes later confirming that the drop-off would be contactless and placed at the door. While waiting, we had the front window open slightly for some ventilation. That window faced directly into the walkway, positioned just to the side of the neighbor's door. From inside, you could hear the gate clearly when it opened or closed, and I heard the gate open once and then close. A few seconds later, it opened again and closed a second time. Shortly after that, the courier sent a final message confirming delivery and wishing us a good night. My partner stood up to retrieve the food, and as he approached the door, our dog reacted in a way that I hadn't seen before. She didn't bark immediately, and she froze, then growled low and continuous, refusing to move away from the window. That alone was enough to put me on edge, but when my partner opened the door, he noticed the food bag was not near the threshold. It had been placed several steps down the path, close to a hedge that ran along the side of the property. Retrieving it would require fully stepping outside and turning away from the door. As he moved toward the bag, he heard movement in the hedge. A man stood up from a crouched position less than 3 meters away. He had been positioned low and partially concealed by the shrubbery, but there was no phone in his hands and no attempt to explain himself. When my partner raised his voice and asked what he was doing, the man turned and just ran back down the path, through the gate and out of sight. The entire interaction lasted only seconds, but we locked the door and turned off the interior lights, and after a few minutes we checked the app and we saw that the courier had already marked the order as completed and was no longer active. We reported the incident through the platform, providing a description and explaining that the delivery had been deliberately placed away from the door, and that the courier had remained on the property after making the delivery. The response we received was pretty generic, to be honest. The company acknowledged the report and refunded the order. We were told the matter would be reviewed internally, and we never received a follow-up. In the weeks after, I changed my name on my account, stopped responding to courier messages, and I no longer opened the door immediately after late-night deliveries. We also installed motion-activated lighting along the path at our own expense, and thankfully, nothing similar happened again. I'm writing this as an adult looking back at something that didn't register as dangerous at the time, but clearly was. So, we had this sort of rotating pool growing up of casual relief teachers, so seeing unfamiliar staff wasn't unusual. One week, a substitute was assigned to cover our mathematics class for several days. He introduced himself, made a few jokes, and came across as sort of relaxed in a way that seemed intentional. During that class, I chose to work in the hallway, which was something that students were occasionally allowed to do if they stayed visible through the open door. About 5 minutes later, the substitute stepped out and sat on the floor beside me. There was no academic reason for it. He began asking really personal questions too, like what music I liked, whether I had older friends, what I planned to do after school, things like this. His language was informal and increasingly inappropriate for a teacher speaking to a 13-year-old. What I mean is that he swore freely and framed it as talking like adults. At the time, I didn't have the vocabulary to label what felt wrong. I only knew that being alone with him for that long felt really uncomfortable. The interaction lasted until another teacher walked past and directly told him to return to the classroom. I assumed that was the end of it. A few weeks later, though, I saw the same substitute assigned to our humanities class. By then, I had noticed a bit of a pattern. Whenever he passed the students in the hallway, especially girls, he made physical contact that was completely unnecessary. A hand on the shoulder, a tap on the back, prolonged eye contact followed by a wink. It was subtle enough that any single instance could be dismissed, but collectively, it was odd. Several girls in my class, independently, decided to relocate to the library to work together. The substitute checked in periodically, and each time he found a reason to stand close, comment on appearances, or touch shoulders under the pretense of guidance. None of this happened in front of male students, mind you. The moment that really shifted things, though, from discomfort to certainty, happened when one of the girls asked a question at the table. He positioned himself directly behind her, close enough that she couldn't stand up without touching him. She moved away immediately, and there was no ambiguity in how intentional the placement was. That afternoon, a group of us went to the deputy principal. 10 students reported similar behavior, independently describing the same patterns. We were interviewed separately, and within a week, the substitute stopped appearing at our school. We believed then that finally the issue had been resolved. But several months later, a teacher quietly told us that he hadn't been dismissed from the system. Instead, that he was reassigned to substitute work at a nearby primary school, working with significantly younger children. And apparently, he had done some inappropriate things that had apparently landed him in some pretty serious trouble. I don't know all of the details about what happened there. To be quite honest, I don't really want to know, but the behavior was known, it was documented, and yet the solution wasn't removal, it was relocation. That's never really sat with me well. At the time, we thought that speaking up was enough, but years later, it's clear that it just wasn't. I'm sharing this now because, well, enough time has passed for me to not look on it with panic anymore, but not enough time that I'll forget the details. Now, to be clear, at the time I didn't think of this as stalking. I only understood that something about the pattern was wrong. This happened during the 2021 to 2022 school year, when I was about 15, attending a secondary school in a mid-sized city. I relied on public transport daily. My schedule was consistent: an early bus to a transfer point, then a short metro ride to school, and I was usually at the stop by about 10 past 7. After a few weeks of the term, I began noticing the same older student on the morning bus. He appeared to be around 17 or 18, I would say. His clothing was pretty unremarkable but repetitive. A baseball cap pulled low, scarf or gaiter covering part of his face regardless of the weather. I noticed him only because he looked directly at me when he boarded, then avoided eye contact afterward. At first, I assumed familiarity explained it. Public transport creates repeated exposure, after all, and so I didn't really think too much more of it. What changed, though, was the timing. So I normally took a 7:15 bus, but that got me to school early, and in November, I switched to a 7:35 bus so that I wouldn't be waiting outside before classes. And within days, the same boy began appearing on the later bus instead. Not occasionally, but consistently. When I changed my afternoon route home due to a shortened school day, he appeared on that route as well, but only on the specific day that my schedule changed. This didn't happen daily, it happened selectively. On the mornings he appeared, his behavior was consistent. He boarded, looked at me briefly, sat several rows away, and never moved. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't use his phone except briefly, as if sending a single message. On days when my schedule differed, he didn't appear at all. There were some additional inconsistencies too that made the situation harder to rationalize. He approached the bus stop from different directions each time, sometimes from streets that did not logically connect to known residential areas even. On afternoons, he exited the bus at the same stop as me, and then he would walk away in varying directions, including routes that led away from schools, shops, or even housing. Once I noticed him board the same bus that I was on, but from a stop at least 4 stops earlier than usual. Another time, he exited a convenience store exactly as I passed it, though I had arrived earlier than normal that day. What made this worse as well is that during this period, I also noticed repeated profile views on my social media from an anonymous account with no photo, minimal activity, and a small overlap of mutual followers from local schools. I couldn't connect it definitively to him, but the timing matched the weeks that I was seeing him most frequently. But then, as winter ended and temperatures rose, the sightings just suddenly stopped. The boy disappeared completely. No gradual reduction, just gone. At the start of the next academic year, I did see him one final time. It was the first morning of classes. He arrived at the bus stop wearing the same cap, but without the face covering. He paused, scanned the group of students, including me, then turned around and walked away from the stop without boarding. He didn't look back. And that's when I noticed something for the first time. He was not 17 or 18. This guy, at least, must have been in his mid-20s. I never did see him again after that, and while nothing overt actually happened, like there was no confrontation, no messages, and no threat, the consistency with which his presence aligned with my own schedule and vanished when it changed left little room for coincidence. He was following me, of that I'm sure. He was stalking me online, that much was clear, and I was clearly a school kid, and he was a man. What makes this even more frightening in hindsight is not what actually occurred at school, but what I heard around the area at the time. Apparently, some young girls had been stalked in similar situations, and had been tried to be pulled into a car by some men who apparently the cops had never caught. And so the question is, was this another one of those attempts? And was it directed at me? This happened before my siblings and I were even born. My parents were staying at my father's childhood home in a rural part of Western Ireland. The house was old, detached, and poorly insulated, with uneven floors and narrow bedrooms. At the time, several relatives were staying there because a longtime family acquaintance had recently died, and people were coming and going over the course of a few days. Now, my mother has a long history of severe migraines. They often come with nausea, light sensitivity, and disrupted sleep. On the night in question, most of the family stayed up late drinking tea and just talking, and my mother excused herself early due to a worsening headache and went to bed alone. My father came in later and fell asleep quickly, and sometime during the night, my mother woke abruptly with the sensation that the mattress was shifting under her weight. She described it as pressure along the edge of the bed, enough that she felt herself sliding toward the floor. This startled her awake fully, and she assumed my father had sat down too hard or shifted suddenly. When she opened her eyes, though, she saw a man standing between the bed and the wall, facing my father. According to her, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in heavy outdoor clothing, like someone who had come in from the cold. A dark coat, thick trousers. She didn't recognize him, though. What struck her most was not his appearance, though, but his behavior. He was making deliberate arm movements toward my father, as if signaling or trying to get his attention, but my father obviously remained asleep. Still groggy and in pain, my mother tried to speak but couldn't form words immediately. She reached out to shake my father awake, and when she turned her head back toward the space beside the bed, the man was gone. Now, there was no sound of a door opening or closing, no footsteps, and nothing else in the room appeared disturbed. She stayed awake there until morning. The following day, she told my father what had happened, and he dismissed it gently, suggesting that it was a vivid dream caused by pain, unfamiliar surroundings perhaps, and maybe some exhaustion. My mother accepted this explanation at the time publicly, but certainly remained unsettled. Later that afternoon, she spoke privately with my father's sister, who she trusted and who knew the household well. She described the man in detail, including his height, build, and clothing. According to my mother, my aunt stopped her mid-sentence, left the room, and returned with an old photograph. The man in the photo closely matched what my mother had described. My aunt explained that the photograph was of the family acquaintance who had died earlier that week, apparently. The clothing in the photo matched what he had worn in the winter, and my mother had never met him in person and had only heard his name in passing. There was no discussion after that. The photo was put away and no one suggested anything paranormal. The explanation offered was stress, suggestion, and the mind filling gaps during partial wakefulness. And my mother didn't argue. They left the house shortly after that, and to this day my mother swears that she saw what she saw. She also says that she hasn't had an experience like it since then, and it's the one time that she says that she thinks that she's seen something paranormal. So, the house itself dated back to the early 1900s and sat on elevated land several miles from the nearest neighbor. The driveway was long, unsealed, and partially overgrown. There was no ambient noise at night other than wind and wildlife there, and even before moving in fully, the isolation was pretty noticeable. After settling, we learned through a local council record that the house had been unoccupied for several years prior to our lease. No major renovations had been completed during that time either. For the first few months, nothing stood out strongly enough to raise concern. There were occasional sounds at night, light impacts, dull knocks, and creaks that could have reasonably been attributed to an aging structure or maybe even some animals moving around the exterior at night, and we accepted those explanations without much discussion. Over time, though, the disturbances became far more difficult to dismiss. Several members of the household began reporting sounds that resembled human activity inside of the house when nobody else was present. These included low voices that didn't resolve into words and brief noises resembling footsteps in adjoining rooms, too. These reports were inconsistent, obviously, sometimes heard by one person, sometimes by two, but never by everyone at once. And because of this inconsistency, we assumed misinterpretation or just the house moving or whatever. But then, the visual disturbances followed. People mentioned movement in peripheral vision that disappeared when looking at it directly. These were brief and non-specific, but frequent enough to be discussed openly. No one initially considered anything abnormal beyond fatigue or heightened awareness due to the environment. But one reoccurring sound that everybody had heard, which really creeped everyone out, was a low growl. We owned several small dogs, and the first assumption was that one of them was responsible. But the pitch and the duration just didn't match their usual vocalizations. The sound was infrequent, but when it occurred, it was distinct enough to be remembered for sure. The first event that caused serious concern involved a video recording as well. One afternoon, while filming indoors near a window that faced open forest, a dark, upright shape briefly crossed behind the glass. The footage was reviewed later, and no family member was outside at the time, and the weather conditions at the time made casual movement around the property pretty unlikely anyway. While the recording quality was pretty poor and inconclusive, it certainly introduced doubt that could not easily be resolved. Around the same period as well, unexplainable injuries began occurring. Superficial scratches appeared on exposed skin, primarily arms and shoulders. We had animals in the house, but the spacing and the orientation of the marks didn't align with typical pet scratches. There were instances where these marks appeared overnight even, when no animals had access to the room. The internal layout of the house contributed to the discomfort too. A narrow corridor connected the living area to a utility room, and from the main seating area, this hallway was fully visible. On multiple occasions, both residents and visiting friends independently reported seeing a figure pass through this space. The movement was slow and consistent, resembling a person walking rather than a shadow flicker. One visitor, who was openly dismissive of paranormal explanations, experienced this firsthand and later refused to stay overnight again. My bedroom was located in a sort of converted area beneath the main structure. It was accessible only from the outside and separated from the rest of the house by at least several meters. At night, too, I frequently heard sounds directly overhead, and none of it corresponded to foot traffic above. There were also faint tapping sounds in the walls and intermittent noises that resembled whispering even. I personally correlated these with plumbing or temperature changes at the time, but I never could find a consistent cause. Near this lower section as well was a maintenance access area housing water equipment. When preparing to remove some things from that place, we inspected the space and we discovered some markings on the concrete floor, along with remnants of wax and soot. The materials appeared old and unused for a long time, and none of the household members were aware of that stuff there prior to that inspection. The land itself also raised some concerns as well. Roughly a quarter of a mile from the house, in a section of uneven terrain with exposed rock formations, we found some discarded items, including damaged toys and decayed paper products. The condition suggested that they had been there for many years, and after consulting with a family member, authorities were notified as a bit of a precaution. No follow-up information was ever provided to me, but that always sat weirdly with me. But the most troubling changes of all were behavioral. My younger sibling, previously even-tempered, became increasingly volatile during our time there. He reported sensations of being touched when alone, and expressed persistent anxiety without clear cause. These issues lessened after we moved, but some residual effects remained for sure. During our time there as well, we also experienced a really unusually high number of pet deaths. Veterinarian explanations varied, but the concentration of incidents during that specific period was noted by multiple family members, and even some of the staff at the vet. We eventually relocated to a newly constructed home in a suburban area, and since then, there have been no comparable incidents. No unexplainable sounds, no visual disturbances, no behavioral changes, and no abnormal loss of animals. I don't claim that what occurred was paranormal. I mean, many of the events could be explained away. However, the consistency of certain experiences across different people, including some skeptics, always prevents me from a complete dismissal. And on top of that, my younger sibling swears that things were going on there that cannot be explained. What remains, I guess, is a really unsettling experience and something that, well, we still talk about from time to time and obviously has impacted all of us. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, I regularly spent nights fishing with a small group of friends along a remote stretch of coastline. The area sits several miles outside of the nearest township, and at night it's largely unlit and unmonitored. We would arrive before dark, set up near the dunes there, and stay until early morning. Locals, they often mentioned odd experiences near the river entrance, particularly after midnight. Most of these stories came from long-term fishermen and night surfers. Common claims include hearing movement on the sand when nobody else was present, indistinct vocal sounds coming from the waterline, and an ongoing sensation of being watched from behind while facing the surf. But none of us took these accounts seriously. The people telling them were often tired, intoxicated, or invested in repeating local folklore. Despite that skepticism, though, the environment itself always created a bit of unease. On certain nights, there was a persistent sense of proximity as well, of something close but not visible. It was not constant, and it never escalated into anything concrete. We attributed it to isolation, fatigue, and the effects of alcohol. One detail that stood out involved a dog belonging to one of the group. The dog, a mixed breed named Atlas, had accompanied us many times without any issue. On a particular night in early autumn, Atlas began reacting to the scrubland behind our camp. He barked repeatedly, held a low posture, and was fixated on the same section of vegetation for hours. Attempts to calm him always failed, and we assumed that something was moving around back there, maybe some wildlife activity, and we didn't really investigate. In the months that followed, Atlas returned several times with us and showed no unusual behavior. This reinforced the idea that the earlier incident was just a one-off. But that assumption changed during a later trip. One night while fishing separately along the shoreline, Atlas and his owner, Mark, positioned themselves roughly 100 meters away from the rest of us. At some point, we heard sustained barking followed by rapid movement. A torch beam appeared, unstable and unfocused, moving toward us at speed. Mark reached us visibly distressed and out of breath. After calming down, he described seeing a human-shaped figure near the dunes. According to him, it moved in an irregular way, lowering itself toward the ground as if searching or reaching. When he shouted, the figure apparently vanished abruptly. He stated that it didn't retreat or move away, it just simply blinked out of existence. We sort of dismissed the account, suggesting that maybe it was shadows or something. Mark disagreed and refused to return to the location afterward, and to my knowledge, he never did. Now, for several years, nothing else occurred that challenged our skepticism of that night. But then, over a decade later, an unrelated incident was discussed in local news forums. So around 2014, a visiting couple reported encountering a person while walking near the same river entrance just after dusk. They described the individual as unsteady and out of place. When they slowed and attempted to keep distance, the person appeared to step toward the waterline and was no longer visible seconds later. No footprints were found in the wet sand. Authorities were notified, but no missing persons or criminal activity were linked to the report. But while I don't claim that these events do confirm the paranormal or anything, they certainly don't sit with me very well. Especially because the similarities between the accounts, separated by years and involving people unfamiliar with one another, well, that's weird, right? That area is still accessible to the public, and I do know people still fish there at night. Stories continue, mostly ignored, occasionally repeated, and I no longer go there. I have gone back and forth for years about whether to share this story, mostly because, well, nothing about the experience fits neatly into a single explanation. What follows happened during a short stay in a renovated hotel complex in downtown Chicago, a property that had changed names and owners multiple times over the decades. So my partner and I checked in during the first week of October 2021 and stayed for 6 nights. We were assigned a corner suite on an upper floor. The room had an open-plan layout with a freestanding bathtub positioned a few feet from the bed, partially separated by a glass divider, and there were no mirrors directly facing the tub, but the fixtures were highly polished and reflective. One afternoon, my partner left the hotel to meet a colleague, leaving me alone in the room. I decided to take a bath, and the bathroom lights were fully on. It was still daylight outside, but at the base of the tub was a stainless steel drain cap, slightly convex and reflective enough to distort, but still show shapes in contrast. Now, as the bathwater drained, I leaned forward to press the stopper, and while looking down, I noticed movement in the reflection. At first, I assumed it was my own shoulder or hair shifting, but then I realized that the reflected shape, it didn't match my movement. Behind my reflected outline, there was a darker form. It was not sharply defined and did not resemble a face or clothing or anything. It appeared as a vertical mass positioned close behind me, offset slightly to my left. The size suggested something human in scale, but the proportions were unclear. I remained still and focused on the reflection for at least several seconds, trying hard to identify the source. But the lighting, it didn't change. The shadow did not move independently, but also didn't align with anything in the room. I turned my head quickly and looked directly behind me, but there was nothing there. No doorway, no furniture, no corner that could have produced a shadow in that location. The wall behind the tub was flat and evenly lit. But when I looked back down, the shape was still present. I attempted to identify alternative explanations. A nearby chair and a shopping bag were positioned sort of several feet away and too low to be reflected at that angle. I adjusted my posture and leaned to one side, but the shape didn't behave like a reflected object would. It remained fixed relative to my body, as if occupying the same physical space behind me. When I looked up again, the space was empty, and when I looked back down once more, this time, whatever was there, it was gone. Well, at that point, I exited the tub immediately. I dried off quickly and stayed in bed until my partner returned. I didn't explore the room or test lighting conditions further, and genuinely I was afraid. Over the remainder of the stay, I noticed something else that I initially dismissed too. In low light, especially at night, I repeatedly saw movement in my peripheral vision. These were not flashes or reflections from outside traffic, mind you. They appeared as silhouettes crossing the living area or standing briefly near the doorway. Whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there, but I was definitely seeing something. I didn't mention it to my partner at first, assuming that it was just fatigue or maybe anxiety triggered by the earlier incident. But 2 nights later, I told him what I had seen in that bathtub. His response was delayed and sort of weirdly restrained. He then told me that on at least 2 nights while I was asleep, he had remained awake in bed and observed what he described as multiple human-shaped forms moving through the living area. He emphasized that they didn't behave erratically or aggressively or anything, but according to him they moved with weird fluidity, as if they were floating almost. He said that he didn't wake me up because he believed that it was just visual misinterpretation of the night caused by the darkness and reflections or whatnot, and we compared details only after leaving the hotel. Neither of us could identify a shared trigger such as alcohol use, medication, or maybe lack of sleep severe enough to account for repeated visual anomalies like this, but we also did not feel threatened, but neither of us felt comfortable while alone in that suite. Since that trip too, I have stayed in many hotels of similar age and layout, and I've never experienced anything like it. I don't actively avoid that property, but I would not choose to stay there again if I had the choice, and so I have never been back there.